Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode. In this one, I'm going to be answering a listener question, Bill Ivy, on the character of George Washington. Bill asked me to talk about George Washington, the man, the husband, and the planter. This is an interesting topic, and it's something that I've covered before in this podcast. In an early episode that came out in 2017, I think, I spoke with Austin Washington, who is a great nephew of George Washington, part of the Washington family, and he wrote a book called George Washington's Guide to Greatness and talked about factors in his education that made him who he was. Now, I think this is an interesting question because as a historical figure, Washington seems beloved by many different people in a way that a lot of people in the past aren't. Napoleon might be respected as a military leader, but in terms of his personal character, he's not really that great. But there's something different about Washington. He has sort of this aura about him that even people at the time would comment on, this aura of greatness. It wasn't just that he was an effective politician or military commander, but he had virtues that aren't typically associated with politicians, of humility, of not seeking out power unnecessarily. And one quote just to kick things off is by Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia contemporary of Washington, who said that Washington had so much martial dignity in his department that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people. There is not a king in Europe that would not look like a valet de chambre by his side. Washington has this je ne sais quoi about him that's hard to pin down. And if you just look at quotes about Washington from contemporary people, from other people in history, they also pay service to this idea. Mark Twain said, George Washington as a boy was ignorant of the commonest accomplishments of youth. Could not even lie. Robert Frost said, I often say of George Washington that he was one of the few in the whole history of the world who was not carried away by power. And Will Rogers said, I bet after seeing us, George Washington would sue us for calling him father. Washington famously only wanted to be called Mr. President. He didn't want any imperial titles of kingship, even though other people like John Adams were suggesting that at the time. He's been compared to Cincinnatus, the Roman general who relinquished power and people kept coming back to him asking him to lead military campaigns, and he only did so begrudgingly, and that's a lot what Washington was like. So in this episode, I'm going to get into Washington's background, character profiles of him, and try to dig into more of his life and things about him. One more little anecdote about Washington before I get into his historical chronology. And this comes in 1783 when General Washington is standing before his officers in a moment of crisis. This is where his men have toiled and suffered for months with little pay, which is practically standard for the Revolutionary War, and Congress didn't appear willing to ante up. Washington could sense the growing possibility of mutiny. In a basic wooden structure that the men called the Temple, Washington reasoned with his subordinates to avoid any measures which will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. As the men listened to his words, Washington thought they were unconvinced by his plea for patience. He began reading a letter from a sympathetic member of the Congress that explained the difficulties the government faced in discharging its war debt. The army would be paid, the member assured, after the Congress resolved other pressing financial matters. The letter was barely legible, and the aging Washington had trouble reading it without stumbling. He paused, removed his glasses from his pocket, and said, Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service and now find myself going blind. So in those two sentences, Washington captured his men. Captain Samuel Shaw wrote of the moment, He spoke, every doubt was dispelled, and the tide of patriotism rolled again in its wonted course. Illustrious man. So the idea being that he bared the difficulty and the burden of those around them, regardless of the situation. So Washington connected with the men as a human being, a patriot engaged in the same struggle, and the army and its general were intertwined. His closing statement echoed in the room. You will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. So in many ways, Washington was the first hero of the young republic, and I would say without much argument the most important figure in American history. In terms of physicality, contemporaries described him as a giant among men. He stood over 6 feet tall and weighed 190 to 200 pounds. And he had incredible feats of strength, and there's talks of people throwing iron rods in Mount Vernon, and he could outthrow even young men. But despite his strength, his countenance was firm but also agreeable. Men wished to copy him and would enthusiastically follow him to the end, and the women of Virginia society called him charming, sincere, and chatty. He was an amusing companion, though sometimes impudent in his conversation. They lined up to dance with him at balls. Jefferson described him as the finest horseman in the country. He commanded respect and admiration from both his countrymen and foreign visitors. So in many ways, without Washington, the U.S. would not exist. So let me dial back and get into his biography and his upbringing, because this is critical in describing who he became, his career, and then some more just kind of general commentary about what he did outside of politics as a planter, as a husbander of livestock, and many other things. Washington was born at Bridges Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on February 22, 1732. His father was a respected man of the community and owned a small plantation between Bridges Creek and Pope's Creek, Virginia. His name was Augustine, but he died 2 years later, and young George spent the next few years living in different households throughout Virginia. He lived with his mother near Fredericksburg, with relatives in Westmoreland, and with his half-brother in Mount Vernon. We don't know a lot about Washington's childhood. There's the story of how the young Washington took a hatchet and cut down a cherry tree, then admitted his deed because he couldn't tell a lie. This tale probably comes from Mason Locke Weems, who lived from 1759 to 1825, who was the author of a biography of Washington that appeared the year after his death. And it's almost definitely made up. At the age of 14, Washington planned to join the British Navy, but reluctantly stayed home in obedience to his mother's wishes. By the age of 16, he'd obtained a basic education in math, surveying, the process of measuring and plotting land, which is very important in a colony that's surrounded by millions and millions of acres of uncharted land and wilderness. He taught himself reading and the usual subjects of his time. He didn't have a formal education, but by modern standards, he'd be considered extremely well educated. His father and brother were his primary tutors, that which he didn't learn on his own. In addition to the topics I mentioned, Washington studied history, theology, and had a great interest in drafting, map-making, and agriculture. His mother instructed him in discipline and morals and helped craft Washington's character. Washington, in time, would become the quintessential Southern gentleman planter. While at Mount Vernon, Washington had contact with the most prominent members of Virginia society, including the powerful and influential Fairfax family. He befriended George William Fairfax, and the two adventurous youths embarked on a month-long adventure in 1748 that took them into the heart of the Virginia wilderness. A year later, at 17, Washington was appointed the county surveyor for Culpeper, a job that carried the energetic young man to the farthest reaches of the Virginia frontier. His experiences on the frontier and his athletic and bold personality earned him the respect of even the most rugged colonists. Lawrence Washington died in 1752 and bequeathed Mount Vernon to George. This allowed Washington to establish himself in Virginia society. So did military service. The governor appointed Washington as district adjutant for Southern Virginia. Washington had a passion for military service and a gift for leadership, qualities that helped him land his first major military assignment. In 1753, Governor Dinwiddie commissioned the 21-year-old Washington to carry an ultimatum to France demanding they vacate lands on the frontier that were claimed by the British. This is before the lead-up to the 7 Years' War, an enormous global conflict between England and some of its allies, and France and her allies, and there are battles that take place in North America and Canada and the Caribbean, in the Philippines. It truly is a global conflict, and this is what Washington was a part of. The theater of combat in North America were called the French and Indian War, but it was just one small part of this global 7 Years' War. Washington had to march more than 100 miles through wintry swampland to find the closest French fort. As expected, the French refused to meet Governor Dinwiddie's demands. Washington had to make much of the return journey on foot after his horses gave out. He was nearly drowned, he was shot at, and almost froze to death. But he delivered the French response, a report that stirred animosity in the colonies and in England. Washington was then commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia in 1754. He was given orders to reinforce the British presence along the Ohio River. He had 150 men, which was too small a force to capture a French fort or make much of an impact on the wild frontier. When Washington arrived near present-day Pittsburgh, he was informed that the French had overwhelmed a detachment of British soldiers and had occupied Washington's intended destination. He moved slowly, built a defensive position called Fort Necessity, not terribly clever named, but very practical, and ultimately engaged a French scouting party in a surprise attack. This battle resulted in the death of the French commanding officer. The French counterattacked and forced Washington to agree to terms. He was tricked into signing a document that stated the French commander had been assassinated. This false admission of guilt, interestingly, helped jumpstart the French and Indian War. George Washington accepted an appointment as General George Braddock's aide in 1755 and accompanied the British in an effort to capture Fort Duquesne. The expedition proved to be a disaster. The British were ambushed and routed. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him, and 4 bullets passed through his jacket. Braddock was killed, and Washington led the remainder of the British forces home. Later that year, Washington was appointed commander of all Virginia militia and charged with defending the Virginia frontier from the French, but most especially from Indians. He served with distinction, and although he was outnumbered with little food and supplies or ammunition, he was able to keep attacking Indian tribes at bay. After the British captured Fort Duquesne in 1758, Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon. He married wealthy widow Martha Custis in 1759 and spent the next few years as a planter, enjoying the social life of aristocratic Virginia. Before getting too far into his military career and his experiences in the American Revolution, I want to mention a little bit more about his self-education. And a lot of this information comes from a book. called A Powerful Mind, The Self-Education of George Washington by Adrian Harrison. Harrison, a former professor of history at West Point, looks at how Washington overcame his lack of formal education through a lifetime dedication to reading, similar to other presidents that were voracious readers, like Teddy Roosevelt comes to mind. Harrison bases her analysis on several catalogs in Washington's library, also records of his purchasing agents in Britain, and his own references to his reading and letters. She concludes that Washington barely read for pleasure or for the sake of learning, but structured his reading to his needs, and characterizes this approach using the phrase, pursuing useful knowledge. And so he thought, as a gentleman farmer, for most of his life, Washington delved into the most current literature on agriculture. He often requested specific works before they were available in English. As a regimental commander in the Virginia militia during the 7 Years' War, he read drill manuals and military handbooks as appropriate to his rank. When elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, he read widely in British constitutional history and politics. When he was named commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, Washington purchased a number of important works on army organization and military history in order to understand logistics and strategy. And finally, as president, he read much into political theory and law. And there's some surprises in his library. He was widely read in abolitionist literature of his day, and the abolitionist movement hadn't really moved into the active and mobilized forces of the mid-19th century it was in the 18th century. A lot of abolitionism was more restricted to certain denominations like the Mennonites or the Quakers. And he was also familiar with architectural literature. He even issued reading lists to officers in his companies on what they thought they should understand in terms of military knowledge or well-rounded educational knowledge in order to be effective in their office. After the French and Indian War, Washington entered politics. He had inherited local importance from his family, so he wasn't really an upstart. His grandfather and great-grandfather had been justices of the peace, a powerful county position in 18th century Virginia. His father had served as sheriff, church warden, and justice of the peace. Lawrence, his half-brother, had been a representative in the Virginia legislature from Fairfax County. George Washington's entry into politics was based on an alliance with the family of Lawrence's father-in-law. He was first elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758 as a representative from Frederick County. From 1760 to 1774, he served as a judge of Fairfax County. His experience on the county court and in the colonial legislature molded his